It was a humid summer evening in the quiet town of Greenfield, a place where life moved at a comfortable, predictable pace. Officer Garrett Patterson was on his usual night patrol, driving slowly down the shadowed streets of Oakwood Heights, a wealthy neighborhood known for its sprawling lawns and gated homes. Garrett, a man in his late 40s with a thick build and a reputation for being by the book, had been with the Greenfield Police Department for over 15 years. However, his record wasn't spotless. It was speckled with whispers of excessive stops and implicit bias. Still, he carried himself with a stern confidence, believing his actions were always justified. That evening, as Garrett made his rounds, he noticed a black sedan parked along the curb in front of one of the larger homes. The car seemed out of place, and though there was no visible sign of trouble, Garrett's instincts, or biases, kicked in. He slowed his cruiser, his eyes narrowing as he scrutinized the vehicle. Its tinted windows prevented him from seeing the occupant clearly, but he felt something was off. Garrett's hand hovered over his radio. "Possible suspicious vehicle at Oakwood Heights," he muttered to dispatch, his voice clipped. He didn't wait for backup, this was his moment to act. He pulled over, activating his lights, their red and blue glare cutting through the stillness of the night. The sedan didn't move. Garrett adjusted his belt, unholstered his flashlight, and stepped out of his cruiser, his boots crunching against the gravel driveway. As he approached the car, his hand rested on the grip of his holstered weapon, a habitual move meant to assert authority. "Driver, roll down your window," Garrett barked, his tone sharp and commanding. There was a pause before the window lowered smoothly, revealing a calm-looking man in his early 50s, dressed in a plain gray polo shirt. His hands were already resting on the steering wheel in clear view. Garrett's flashlight beamed directly into the man's face, making him squint. "Evening, officer," the man said, his voice steady, betraying no fear. "Is there a problem?" "Let's see some ID," Garrett snapped, ignoring the question. He scrutinized the driver's features, noting the deep brown skin and short-cropped hair. His suspicions only deepened, fueled by prejudices he wouldn't admit to even himself. The man sighed softly but complied, reaching slowly into his glove compartment. Garrett's hand tightened on his holster as if anticipating trouble. "Easy there," Garrett warned. "I'm just grabbing my wallet," the man replied calmly, retrieving it and handing over his license. Garrett snatched it and stepped back toward his cruiser, without another word. The flashlight beam lingered on the man's face for a moment longer than necessary, before Garrett turned away. Back in his cruiser, Garrett entered the license details into the system. His brow furrowed as the information came up. Marcus Daniels. The name tickled a memory in the back of his mind, but he couldn't place it immediately. Garrett leaned out of his window and glanced back at the man sitting patiently in the sedan. Something about him exuded authority, a quiet confidence that felt out of place to Garrett. He returned to the car, holding the license out but not handing it back yet. "What are you doing in this neighborhood, Mr. Daniels? This doesn't look like your typical hangout spot." His voice was heavy with insinuation. Daniels tilted his head slightly, his gaze steady. "Officer, I live here. That's my house right behind you." He pointed toward the sprawling home behind Garrett's cruiser. Garrett's jaw tightened. "Uh-huh. Got proof of that?" Garrett asked, doubling down. Daniels raised an eyebrow. "My address is on the license you're holding." Garrett didn't look, refusing to be deterred. Instead, he stepped closer to the car. "I've got neighbors in this area who don't take kindly to suspicious activity. Sitting in a car at this hour doesn't exactly scream resident." Daniel's calm demeanor faltered slightly, his tone growing firmer. "Officer, I've answered your questions. Now, if there's no legal issue, I'd like to go inside." The exchange was tense, and the air seemed to thicken with every passing second. Garrett wasn't used to being challenged, and he didn't like it. He opened his mouth to respond when a sudden glimmer of recognition hit him. That name, Marcus Daniels, where had he heard it before? And then it clicked. His heart sank. This was no ordinary resident. This was Chief Marcus Daniels, the head of the Greenfield Police Department. Garrett's boss. The man who had spearheaded community outreach programs and diversity initiatives, often spotlighted in the local news. He was the very figure Garrett had dismissed in casual conversations at the station, deeming such efforts as political pandering. Garrett's hand dropped from his holster as a wave of realization and dread washed over him. He had just racially profiled the most powerful figure in the department. Daniels, meanwhile, said nothing. He didn't need to. His eyes locked onto Garrett's, unblinking and steady, holding an unspoken question, "What will you do now?" The air between the two men grew heavier as Garrett stood frozen, still clutching Chief Daniels' license in his hand. His mind raced, scrambling for a way to salvage the situation. His instinct was to retreat, to wave it off as a misunderstanding and move on, but pride and panic rooted him to the spot. He had made too many assumptions, and now he found himself staring down the consequences of his actions. Daniels, still seated in his car, seemed unbothered on the surface, but there was an undeniable intensity behind his calm. He didn't flinch or rush to fill the silence. He simply waited, as if daring Garrett to make the next move. The moment dragged on, each second stretching unbearably. Finally, Garrett cleared his throat and spoke, his voice faltering slightly. "Look, sir," he began, stumbling over the word as it left his mouth. "There's been some kind of misunderstanding here." "Misunderstanding?" Daniels replied, his tone sharp but not raised. "You pulled me over in front of my own house, accused me of looking suspicious, and questioned whether I belong here. What exactly did you misunderstand?" The words cut deeper than Garrett anticipated, and he shifted uncomfortably on his feet. His defensive instincts flared. "With all due respect, Chief," he said, leaning on the title as if it could defuse the situation, "I was just doing my job. I saw a vehicle parked here late at night and needed to make sure everything was okay. You can understand that, right?" Daniel's expression didn't change. He didn't even blink. "What I understand, Officer Patterson, is that you made assumptions based solely on what you saw, not the facts. Tell me, would you have pulled over if this was one of our white neighbors sitting in their car? Or would you have assumed they were waiting for someone and kept driving?" Garrett opened his mouth to respond but found no words that didn't sound hollow or defensive. He felt his authority slipping, and he hated it. His grip on the situation was weakening, and he knew it. "I'm not going to stand here and debate what's right or wrong with you, Chief," Garrett said, his tone harder now, grasping for control. "Like I said, I was just following protocol." Daniel's brow furrowed slightly. His calm started to show faint cracks, though his voice remained steady. "Protocol doesn't include harassment or intimidation, officer. And it certainly doesn't involve escalating a non-incident because you're too proud to admit a mistake." Garrett stiffened, feeling a surge of anger rise in his chest. He had prided himself on being a no-nonsense officer, one who didn't take criticism lightly, especially from someone he believed didn't understand what it was like to be out on the streets. But this wasn't just anyone. This was the man who could determine his career's trajectory with a single word. Before Garrett could respond, the quiet street began to stir. A porch light flicked on across the street, and the faint silhouette of a neighbor standing in their doorway became visible. The sound of a dog barking echoed down the block. Garrett realized they were attracting attention, and it only added to his unease. Daniels noticed, too, glancing toward the light before turning his attention back to Garrett. "You're drawing quite the crowd, officer," he said, his voice edged with irony. "Might want to consider how this looks." Garrett's jaw clenched. The last thing he needed was witnesses complicating the situation further. He took a step back, his flashlight lowering slightly as if conceding a fraction of the tension. But before he could decide his next move, a car pulled onto the street, its headlights cutting through the night. It was another patrol car. Garrett's stomach sank as his supervisor, Sergeant Walker, stepped out of the vehicle. A no-nonsense man with decades of experience, Walker was well respected within the department for his fairness and integrity. He took one look at the scene, the chief of police in his car, Garrett standing stiffly nearby, and the growing attention from the neighbors, and immediately understood that something was wrong. "Patterson," Walker called out, his voice firm and measured as he approached. "What's going on here?" Garrett swallowed hard, feeling sweat prickling the back of his neck. He hesitated, unsure how to frame the situation without incriminating himself. "Just a routine stop, sir," he said, his voice wavering slightly. "I saw a suspicious vehicle and, pulled it over to check things out." Walker's gaze flicked to Daniels, who was now stepping out of his car. His presence was commanding, even without the badge or uniform. Walker's face hardened as he processed the implications of what he was seeing. "Chief Daniels," Walker said, addressing him respectfully. "Is everything all right here?" Daniels met Walker's eyes, his expression unreadable for a moment. Then he nodded slightly. "Sergeant, I'll let you be the judge of that. Your officer here stopped me in front of my own home, accused me of suspicious activity, and refused to let me go even after I explained who I was." Walker's face darkened, his lips pressing into a thin line. He turned to Garrett, his voice low but tense. "Is that true, Patterson?" Garrett stammered, struggling to form a coherent response. I didn't recognize him at first. I thought." "You thought wrong," Walker interrupted sharply, cutting him off. "Step back to your car, Patterson. Now." Garrett hesitated but obeyed, retreating with his flashlight lowered and his heart pounding in his chest. He felt his authority unraveling completely, leaving him exposed and vulnerable. Walker turned back to Daniels, his tone shifting to one of quiet apology. "Chief, I deeply regret this. I'll make sure it's handled appropriately." Daniels nodded again, his expression softening slightly. "Thank you, Sergeant. I'll leave it in your hands." With that, Daniels stepped back toward his house, his movements measured and composed. He didn't look back at Garrett as he walked away, but his silence spoke volumes. It wasn't anger or retaliation that lingered in the air, it was disappointment, and somehow that stung even more. As Daniels disappeared into his home, Garrett sat in his cruiser, staring blankly at the dashboard. He could feel the weight of what had just transpired pressing down on him, and for the first time in his career, he wasn't sure how to justify his actions. To himself or anyone else, the weight of the night's events clung to Officer Garrett Patterson like a suffocating fog. As the blue and red lights of his cruiser cast eerie shadows across the quiet neighborhood, he sat rigid in his seat, hands gripping the steering wheel as if it were the only thing tethering him to reality. His supervisor, Sergeant Walker, was still standing on the sidewalk, talking quietly into his radio. Garrett couldn't make out the words, but he didn't need to. The damage was done, and he knew it. When Walker finally returned to Garrett's car, the older man's face was unreadable, a mask of professionalism that betrayed nothing of the storm brewing beneath. He leaned down to Garrett's window, his voice calm but edged with steel. "Patterson, head back to the station. Now." The command was simple, but its weight was crushing. Garrett didn't dare argue. With a stiff nod, he put the car in gear and drove off, his thoughts racing faster than the cruiser could take him. The familiar streets blurred past as his mind replayed every moment of the encounter. Each misstep, every word he had said, felt like a glaring indictment. He couldn't shake the image of Chief Daniels' steady gaze, the quiet authority that had left him feeling small and exposed. Back at the station, the atmosphere was unusually tense. News of the incident had already begun to ripple through the department. Officers exchanged glances as Garrett walked in, their conversations halting mid-sentence. He avoided their eyes, heading straight to his desk, but the silence was deafening. Sergeant Walker arrived shortly after, his expression grave. "In my office," he barked, and Garrett followed without a word. Walker closed the door behind them, the sharp click of the latch echoing in the small room. He didn't sit. Instead, he stood behind his desk, arms crossed, staring down at Garrett with a look that was equal parts disappointment and frustration. "What were you thinking out there?" Walker demanded, his voice low but laced with anger. "You stopped the chief of police." You escalated a situation that never should have been a situation in the first place. Do you have any idea what kind of position you put this department in? Garrett fumbled for a response, his voice weak. I didn't know it was him. I thought. Stop, Walker snapped, cutting him off. You thought what? That a black man sitting in his car outside a house in Oakwood Heights couldn't possibly belong there? That's what this boils down to, Patterson. Don't try to deny it. Garrett's face burned, but he didn't argue. What could he say? The truth was undeniable, and they both knew it. Walker exhaled sharply, running a hand through his graying hair. Do you have any idea how bad this looks? We're already under scrutiny from the community, and now this? The chief isn't going to let this slide, and frankly, I don't blame him. Garrett's stomach churned at the implication. Am I being fired? Walker's eyes narrowed. That's not up to me. But if I were you, I'd start preparing for the possibility. In the meantime, you're on administrative leave, effective immediately. Hand over your badge and gun. The words hit Garrett like a punch to the gut. He had never imagined himself in this position, stripped of his authority, his career hanging by a thread. Slowly, he unhooked his badge from his uniform and placed it on Walker's desk, followed by his service weapon. His hands trembled as he stepped back, suddenly feeling exposed and vulnerable without the symbols of his power. You're dismissed, Walker said, his tone final. Go home, and don't come back until you're told otherwise. Garrett nodded numbly and left the office, the weight of his failure pressing down on him with every step. As he walked through the station, he could feel the eyes of his colleagues on him, their silence louder than any words. He kept his head down, avoiding their stares, and stepped out into the cool night air. The drive home was a blur. By the time Garrett pulled into his driveway, exhaustion had settled over him like a heavy blanket. He sat in his car for a long moment, staring at the darkened windows of his house, dreading the conversation he knew he would have to have with his wife. Inside, the house was quiet. His wife, Lisa, was sitting on the couch, scrolling through her phone. She looked up as he entered, her expression shifting from surprise to concern. You're home early. What happened? Garrett hesitated, the words catching in his throat. I got put on leave, he finally admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Lisa frowned, setting her phone aside. Why? What happened? He sighed heavily, sinking into a chair. I pulled someone over tonight. Someone important. And I handled it poorly. Lisa's brow furrowed in confusion. Important? Who was it? Garrett hesitated, then muttered, Chief Daniels. Her eyes widened in shock. The chief of police? Garrett, what were you thinking? I didn't know it was him, he said defensively, though the excuse felt hollow even to him. I thought he was. A threat? Lisa finished, her tone sharp. Garrett, you've been a cop for years. You're supposed to be able to read situations better than this. He didn't respond, unable to meet her gaze. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken accusations. Finally, Lisa sighed and stood, walking toward the kitchen. You need to figure this out, Garrett. Because if you don't, it's not just your career on the line, it's our family's future. Garrett sat alone in the living room, the weight of her words sinking in. He had always prided himself on being a good cop, someone who upheld the law and protected his community. But now, he couldn't help but question everything. Was he really the man he thought he was? Or had he been blind to his own flaws all along? As the night wore on, Garrett's mind churned with regret and uncertainty. He thought of Chief Daniels, the quiet authority in his voice, the steady gaze that had seen right through him. Garrett had always believed he was in control, but tonight, he had been stripped of that illusion. And for the first time, he was forced to confront the uncomfortable truth. The problem wasn't just the system, it was him. The days that followed Garrett's suspension were a strange blur of silence and introspection. The once familiar rhythm of his life as a police officer had been replaced by an unnerving stillness. No roll calls, no patrols, no partner ribbing him over coffee. He spent most of his time in his small, cluttered office at home, staring at the framed photos of his academy graduation and department commendations. They felt like relics from another life, mocking reminders of the respect he thought he had earned and the values he believed he upheld. Lisa avoided bringing up the incident directly, but her presence carried an unspoken tension. Their conversations were clipped, functional, and devoid of the warmth they once shared. Garrett couldn't blame her. The situation had pulled a thread loose in their lives, and everything now felt like it was unraveling. One afternoon, as Garrett sat brooding by the window, his phone buzzed. The number on the screen wasn't one he recognized, but something about it made his chest tighten. He hesitated for a moment before answering. "Officer Patterson?" a steady voice asked on the other end. "Speaking," Garrett replied cautiously, though he wasn't sure he had the right to call himself an officer anymore. "This is Chief Daniels," the voice said, calm and deliberate. Garrett's heart dropped. "Yes, Chief," Garrett managed, gripping the phone tightly. There was a pause, brief but heavy. Then Daniels spoke again. "I'd like you to come down to the precinct tomorrow morning." "Not in uniform." "Just you." Garrett's mind raced. Was this it? The meeting where they would make his suspension permanent, officially end his career? Or was it something worse? He swallowed hard. "I'll be there." The next morning, Garrett arrived at the precinct feeling exposed without his badge and gun. The building, once a place of pride, now loomed over him like a fortress he no longer belonged in. He stepped inside, the familiar sights and sounds somehow alien. A few colleagues glanced his way, their expressions unreadable. Chief Daniels' office was at the end of the hall, its door slightly ajar. Garrett approached, his pulse hammering in his ears. He knocked lightly, and Daniels' voice called out, "Come in." The office was modest but neatly organized, the shelves lined with awards, commendations, and framed photos of community events. Daniels sat behind his desk, his expression neutral. He gestured to a chair across from him. "Sit," he said. Garrett obeyed, feeling like a schoolboy called to the principal's office. The silence stretched as Daniels studied him, as though weighing every aspect of the man before him. "You've had some time to think," Daniels began, folding his hands on the desk. "Tell me what you've learned." The question caught Garrett off guard. He had expected a lecture, a list of his failures, not this. He struggled for words, the weight of his reflection pressing on him. "I learned that I made a terrible mistake," Garrett said finally, his voice low. "I made assumptions based on prejudice. I didn't realize it at the time, but looking back, it's clear as day. I let my biases control my actions, and I was wrong." Daniels didn't respond immediately. He leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "Do you know how many times I've been stopped like that in my life, Patterson?" he asked, his tone calm but laced with something deeper. Garrett shook his head, unsure how to respond. "Too many to count," Daniels continued. "And every time, it's the same story: suspicion, hostility, and excuses. You're not the first officer to make this mistake, but you have a chance to be one of the few who actually learns from it." Garrett felt a lump rise in his throat. "Chief, I don't know how to fix this. I don't even know where to start." Daniels' gaze softened slightly. "Acknowledging the problem is a start. But it's not enough. You need to understand why you reacted the way you did. And more importantly, you need to understand the impact it has, not just on the people you stop, but on the entire community you're supposed to serve." Garrett nodded, the gravity of Daniels' words sinking in. He had spent years believing he was a good cop, someone who treated everyone equally. But now he saw the cracks in that belief, the blind spots he had ignored. Daniels leaned forward, his voice firm. "I'm not here to ruin your career, Patterson. I'm here to challenge you. To see if you're willing to do the hard work of changing, of becoming better. This isn't about one incident, it's about who you are as an officer and as a person." Garrett felt a surge of emotion, relief, gratitude, and shame all rolled into one. I want to change, he said earnestly. I don't want to be the kind of cop who lets bias dictate his actions. I'll do whatever it takes to make this right. Daniel studied him for a long moment, then nodded. Good. Because this isn't just about you. It's about rebuilding trust, with me, with the department, and with the community. And that's going to take time and effort. Are you ready for that? Yes, Chief, Garrett said, his voice steady, despite the nerves coursing through him. I am. Daniel stood, signaling the end of the meeting. Then let's get to work. Report to community outreach tomorrow morning. You'll be shadowing Officer Ramirez on her neighborhood rounds. And Patterson? Garrett paused at the door, turning back. Don't waste this opportunity, Daniel said, his tone firm but not unkind. It's more than most people get. Garrett nodded, a sense of purpose stirring in him for the first time in days. As he left the precinct, the weight of his mistake hadn't disappeared, but it no longer felt like an anchor. It felt like a challenge, a chance to prove, to himself and others, that he could be better. He had no illusions about the road ahead. It would be long and difficult, filled with uncomfortable truths and hard conversations. But for the first time, he was ready to face it head-on. He owed that much to the chief, to the community, and most of all, to himself. The next morning, Garrett arrived at the community center feeling a mix of apprehension and determination. The center, nestled in the heart of a neighborhood he had rarely patrolled, was bustling with activity. Children ran across the small playground, their laughter mingling with the chatter of parents and volunteers setting up for a food drive. It was a world Garrett had seen from a distance, but never truly stepped into. Today, that would change. Officer Ramirez greeted him at the front entrance with a firm handshake and a skeptical smile. Ramirez was well known in the department for her deep ties to the community. She had a knack for connecting with people, earning their trust in a way that made her a vital bridge between law enforcement and the public. Garrett couldn't help but notice the guarded look in her eyes as she sized him up. So, you're my shadow for the day, she said, her tone neutral. Let's see how this goes. Garrett nodded, choosing not to push back against her visible reservations. He couldn't blame her. His presence here was a consequence of his actions, and he had a lot to prove, not just to her, but to everyone. Their first stop was a small corner store run by an elderly man named Mr. Davis. As Ramirez chatted with him about a recent break-in nearby, Garrett hung back, observing. He noticed how Ramirez spoke with genuine interest, asking about Mr. Davis's family and checking in on his health. It wasn't just a routine visit, it was a relationship built on trust and mutual respect. When they left, Ramirez turned to Garrett. You don't say much, do you? Just trying to learn, he replied, feeling out of place. She raised an eyebrow. Good. Because there's a lot you need to learn. The day continued with more stops, a local bakery where the owner shared concerns about late-night loitering, a park where teenagers played basketball and greeted Ramirez with easy familiarity, a senior center where she listened patiently to an elderly woman's worries about rising crime. Each interaction revealed the depth of her connection to the community and highlighted just how much Garrett had missed in his years of patrolling from behind a windshield. By mid-afternoon, Ramirez led Garrett to a small community meeting in a church basement. The room was filled with residents from all walks of life, parents, activists, small business owners, and even a few teenagers. The topic of the meeting was police accountability, and as Garrett took a seat at the back of the room, he felt the weight of their gazes on him. The discussion was raw and unfiltered. Residents shared stories of harassment, mistrust, and fear. One man, a teacher named Marcus, spoke passionately about how his teenage son had been stopped and frisked multiple times for no apparent reason. His voice cracked as he described the impact it had on his son's confidence and sense of safety. Garrett shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his chest tightening with guilt. These weren't just abstract complaints, they were real stories, real pain, caused by people wearing the same uniform he had once been proud to wear. When the meeting ended, Ramirez approached Garrett. How are you holding up? She asked, her tone softer than before. It's a lot, he admitted. Hearing their stories, it's hard not to feel like I've been part of the problem. Ramirez nodded. Good. That means you're starting to understand. But don't just feel guilty, do something about it. Guilt doesn't change anything. Action does. Her words stayed with Garrett as they returned to the community center. The day had been exhausting, both physically and emotionally, but it had also been eye-opening. He realized how disconnected he had been from the people he was supposed to serve, how easy it had been to reduce them to stereotypes and statistics. As the sun set, Ramirez handed Garrett a stack of flyers for an upcoming neighborhood cleanup. "Be here Saturday morning," she said. "It's a good way to show people you're serious about building trust." "I'll be here," Garrett promised. Over the next few weeks, Garrett immersed himself in community work. He attended block parties, volunteered at food drives, and participated in after-school programs. At first, people were wary of him, their smiles guarded, their conversations polite but distant. But slowly, as they saw him show up day after day, their attitudes began to shift. One afternoon, while helping repaint a graffiti-covered wall near the park, a young boy approached Garrett with a basketball in hand. "You play?" the boy asked, his tone challenging. Garrett smiled, setting down his paintbrush. "A little." "You think you can take me?" The boy grinned, and within minutes, a small crowd had gathered to watch the impromptu game. For the first time in weeks, Garrett felt a sense of belonging, a connection to the people he had once seen as strangers. The turning point came during another community meeting, where Garrett was invited to speak. He stood nervously at the front of the room, his palms sweaty as he faced the crowd. "I'm not here to make excuses for what I did," he began, his voice steady despite the tension in the room. "I made a mistake, a big one. I let my biases cloud my judgment, and I hurt someone who didn't deserve it. But I'm here because I want to be better. I want to listen, to learn, and to earn back your trust." The room was silent as Garrett spoke, his words raw and unpolished. When he finished, there was a long pause before Marcus, the teacher whose son had been stopped, stood up. "I appreciate your honesty," Marcus said, his tone cautious but sincere. "It's a start. But words aren't enough. We'll be watching to see if your actions back them up." Garrett nodded, understanding the weight of Marcus's words. Trust wasn't something that could be rebuilt overnight, it had to be earned through consistent effort and accountability. As the meeting ended, Chief Daniels approached Garrett, a faint smile on his face. "You've come a long way," he said. "But the work isn't over." "It never is." "I know," Garrett replied, his voice resolute. "And I'm ready for it." For the first time in a long while, Garrett felt a sense of purpose, not as a police officer enforcing the law, but as a member of a community working to make things right. It was a humbling journey, but one he was determined to see through. Months passed, and Garrett's life became unrecognizable from the rigid, insular routine he had once followed. His days were now a whirlwind of community events, workshops, and listening sessions. Each interaction, no matter how small, peeled back another layer of misunderstanding and fear, both his own and the community's. Slowly, cautiously, bridges were being built. But Garrett knew his redemption wasn't a moment, it was a continuous journey, one that demanded honesty and vulnerability every step of the way. One particularly cold morning, Garrett found himself at the community center again, this time leading a workshop on building trust between police officers and residents. He had prepared meticulously, pulling from his own mistakes and lessons, but the nervousness was still there. Facing a room full of people who had every reason to distrust him wasn't easy, even now. As he began speaking, Garrett focused on sharing his personal journey, the biases he had carried, the pivotal moment with Chief Daniels, and the steps he had taken since to understand the deeper issues at play. He didn't sugarcoat anything. He admitted his failures outright, laying bare the flaws that had once defined him. "I've learned that being a good officer isn't just about enforcing the law," he said, his voice steady despite the weight of the moment. "It's about serving people, truly serving them. That means listening, understanding, and earning trust, not demanding it. I didn't get that before, but I'm doing everything I can to get it now." The room was silent for a moment, and Garrett felt a familiar knot in his stomach. Had he said the wrong thing? Was his effort enough? Then, to his surprise, a woman in the front row raised her hand. "I've seen you at the food drives and the cleanup events," she said, her tone cautious but thoughtful. "My son said you played basketball with him and his friends. They told me you didn't just show up, you stayed. You listened. That means something." A murmur of agreement rippled through the room, and Garrett felt a small wave of relief. It wasn't full forgiveness, but it was a start, and he was grateful for it. Later that day, Garrett was approached by Marcus, the teacher whose story about his son had struck a chord during Garrett's first community meeting. Marcus's expression was softer now, his guarded demeanor replaced with something closer to curiosity. "Patterson," Marcus began, his voice measured. "I'll be honest, I didn't think you'd stick around. I've seen plenty of officers talk a good game and disappear when it's time to do the real work. But you're still here." Garrett nodded, unsure of how to respond. "I don't think I'll ever stop needing to do the work," he said finally. "This isn't about making up for one mistake. It's about changing who I am, how I think, and what kind of officer I want to be. That's not a quick fix." Marcus studied him for a moment before extending a hand. "Keep at it," he said simply. Garrett shook his hand, feeling a small but significant weight lift off his shoulders. The biggest test of Garrett's commitment came on an otherwise quiet Saturday afternoon. He was volunteering at a youth mentorship program when his phone buzzed with an urgent message from Ramirez. A protest was forming downtown in response to an incident involving another department. The situation was tense, with emotions running high on both sides. Garrett rushed to the scene, unsure of what to expect. When he arrived, he saw a large crowd gathered, holding signs and chanting. Across from them stood a line of officers, their faces unreadable behind riot gear. The atmosphere crackled with tension, and Garrett's stomach churned. He spotted Chief Daniels near the edge of the crowd, speaking calmly to a group of protesters. Garrett made his way over, and Daniels glanced at him with a nod. "Good timing," the chief said. "We could use your perspective here." Garrett hesitated. "What can I do?" "Listen," Daniels said simply. "And if the moment calls for it, speak." Garrett took a deep breath and approached the crowd, his hands raised to show he wasn't a threat. A few people recognized him from the community center and eyed him warily. "I'm here to listen," he said, projecting his voice over the din. "I know I've made mistakes in the past, but I'm trying to be part of the solution now. If you'll let me, I want to hear what you have to say." At first, the crowd was skeptical. A few people shouted questions, their voices sharp with frustration and anger. But Garrett didn't flinch. He listened intently, nodding and making eye contact, refusing to shy away from their pain. Gradually, the shouting softened, replaced by a steady stream of stories and grievances. Garrett didn't interrupt or defend himself, he simply listened, letting their words sink in. When the protest ended, Garrett stayed behind, helping to clean up discarded signs and debris. A few protesters approached him, their expressions tentative but curious. "You're not like the others," one young woman said. "I've been like them before," Garrett admitted. "But I'm trying to be better. For all of us." As the sun dipped below the horizon, Garrett felt a cautious sense of hope. The road ahead was still long, and there would be setbacks, but moments like this reminded him why the work mattered. Weeks later, Garrett sat across from Chief Daniels in his office, the atmosphere markedly different from their first tense meeting. Daniels leaned back in his chair, a faint smile playing on his lips. "You've come a long way, Patterson," he said. "I wasn't sure you'd make it, but you proved me wrong." Garrett felt a surge of gratitude but shook his head. "I'm still learning, Chief. I don't think this work ever really ends." Daniels nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Good. Because it's not about reaching a finish line, it's about the journey. And you're on the right path." As Garrett left the office, he felt a sense of purpose he hadn't experienced before. He wasn't just a cop anymore, He was a part of something bigger, a movement toward understanding, accountability, and change. The work was hard, but it was worth it. And for the first time, Garrett felt like he was truly serving the people he had sworn to protect.